As crazy as it sounds, Washington's receiver depth could be tested this week.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Into another Tuesday edition of Locked On Huskies. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That gentleman right there is Lars Hanson. We write for Inside the Huskies with Fan Nation and Sports Illustrated. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. Lars Hanson, great to have you here. And we talked about it real quick right before we jumped on here. Washington receiver depth could be tested this week against Arizona State with a couple of injuries. Do you want to just kind of take us through this?
I mean, I'm not sure if this is the beginning of a comedy routine or if, we're actually being serious, but no, to be fair, it actually is a legitimate question. But it's also crazy to think about, right? Where it's like Washington in the future will have three outstanding receivers that are currently freshmen, Rashid Williams, Keith Reynolds, and Tayshaun Lyons. However, at this point, those guys shouldn't be playing. So and the other thing that was mentioned today, we haven't seen Denzel Boston really at all this season, which is a little different than what we saw last season, where because of how Germie Bernard, a few other things came up, Denzel got a lot more playing time. This season, he hasn't gotten that, but I think because he has those bank reps, that's not necessarily a concern, right? And I think especially when you put it in the grand picture of, well, Rome and Jalen both came back, so it would be almost insulting to them if Denzel is getting even more reps and, taking targets away from those guys, especially because of the impact they, which is not a slight to Denzel, but it's more or less to say, hey, look, let's kind of do right by the guys who did right for us. And so I think it's now getting interesting with Jalen, missing most of the Oregon game because he re-aggravated the injury that he had against Michigan State in the first half, towards the end of the first half. It's one of those where they're being cautious with it. They have enough weapons to make it work, but we've seen them struggle at times without that third release valve. I mean, Jalen Polk's been great. He went for another 100-yard game. Roman Odunze did his usual 120, 130, whatever he had in a couple of touchdowns. But to make that, and as we said on the, I believe, Monday show or post-game show, they need that third release valve just to kind of make that. And it's the one that's over the middle, right? Which actually was the route that Giles Jackson ran on the opening, I believe it was the opening touchdown, right? Where Penix hit him for the 26-yarder. It was one of those where it's like, oh, wow, okay, but that's perfect for Giles because he's that guy who just in the middle of the field, a little more stretched out, can really stretch the defense, especially in one-on-one coverage. So they certainly have the bodies, but since, Giles is still just coming back from his injury, Jalen kind of working through his injury sort of thing, that means you really only have Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk, which are fine, but when you play against the elite teams like they did against Oregon, that gets a little harder to achieve where, no offense, we'll talk about the opponent coming up, Arizona State. You're probably going to be easier to cook against Arizona State, Cal, Michigan State's defense, that sort of thing.
Right. And so just one thing that I wanted to make sure that we noted right at the top is when we talk about Jalen McMillan's injury that Ryan Grubb said he re-aggravated, said, I don't know about you, but I don't think he made it sound like it was too serious or might hold him out that long because he kind of said, his strength was good. He was okay. And it was kind of just weird that it got re-aggravated and he just kind of couldn't keep going, which was kind of the thing. He said there was no damage of any kind, that he was getting checked out again on Monday as we record this, but it didn't sound like it was going to be too much of an issue with anything. But if he does have to miss another game or two, especially just due to safety reasons, with USC just kind of down the road, just kind of within eyesight at this point, I think that that's something to be just noted. And then Germie Bernard too, who also injured his ankle, as Grubb said this morning. That's another one that you just kind of want to keep an eye on a little bit. And you talked about Giles Jackson, and he's an awesome guy to just kind of have come back at the time that he did. We know he injured his thumb early on in the preseason, and there were talks of redshirting him, which might still occur just from the way certain things were phrased by the coaches this morning as we just returned from their press conference. But who knows kind of how that's going to play out. And I know that's one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this, was because if both, let's say, just, for argument's sake, if both Jalen McMillan and Germie Bernard have to miss the next game against Arizona State, Giles Jackson has to play. Like there's no doubt about that. And then there's a bigger role for Denzel Boston, and you can kind of go from there and you can see what happens. And of course, we've talked about the running backs and the tight ends, who are also just really important pieces of this offense when it comes to pass catchers at this point. But I feel like that's just something that we really are going to have to keep an eye on this week.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, it's not that there's a lack of weapons. It just means the game plan changes as to who the weapons become. How do you get those third down conversions? The one to Westover, there's a couple that they had. I mean, the one to Culp that ended up being flagged on Devin Williams for pass interference, that sort of thing, where you're not necessarily worried about a true drop in production, especially against teams that are weaker than you. But especially, I think it really comes down to you're planning for Utah and Oregon, and USC, and to a degree, Oregon State, right?
Right.
Where especially because if the thing is, if you push Jalen, right, if you pushed him to continue going in that game, and let's say that injury does actually get worse, right, something else happens to where there actually is damage. Now he's going to miss certainly the USC game and potentially even more. So it's like it's worth it for the coaches to say, look, let's not push it. We got enough horses on this roster. Let's just kind of make do with what we got for now. And that's why it's the perfect timing to get Giles Jackson back, because you have a perfect kind of answer for the lack of McMillan. And Bernard's kind of been somewhat that guy, but I think Giles, his veteran presence, he's got a bit of a dynamic personality and a dynamic play on the field. He's a guy that that's the thing that I've touched on a lot with Giles, is where he's not the most targeted guy on the team. I think last year he had 32 targets, but he had 30 catches.
Right.
And I believe he either had one drop or no drops. But the point is that's Penix's go-to guy when everybody else is down. And so I think, to your point, if he's able to come back and continue to just be serviceable, he doesn't have to go for 120. He doesn't have to go for a big game. He certainly is capable of that. But I think Giles in this offense is just kind of that X factor that if you have him, you can be okay without McMillan. You can survive without McMillan. But if you have, to your point, if you don't have both of them, then you're really in trouble.
Right. And that's just, it's something just we wanted to just keep an eye on moving forward. Right. I know I just said that, but it really is, because then you talked about Giles being not just like a trustworthy security blanket, because we saw that with Penix, but we also saw that with Austin Mack in the during fall practice, where the guy that he turned to a lot when he was running the second string offense was Giles Jackson, where it's just, it's a third down, or I need to move the chains right now. Who am I going to go to? I'm going to go to Giles. And we saw Mike do that on fourth down in the red zone, where he moved the chains to Giles on the touchdown too. But then you talked about his veteran presence. Another thing that he noted, and when I was going back and just watching some of the replays yesterday just of the broadcast, Kirk Herbstreit noted that on Jalen Polk's touchdown, where Michael Penix made a gorgeous throw, one of the people who just kind of helped with the clear out was Giles Jackson, because they stacked him on that side of the formation. And it was something that you just, no offense to, just Tayshaun Lyons or Rashid Williams, they don't bring that same type of presence. And Denzel Boston can, but Denzel Boston is just a totally different type of receiver when he's on the field. So you don't necessarily, when you see him in that formation, you're going to think something completely different. And he might not just give the same kind of energy, because his skill set just fits a little bit differently into the offense. He fits more into the Odunze role, what he's doing, where you can just kind of leave him out on an island at the X and just kind of let him go to work, kind of thing.
Right. And I mean, to be clear, I know you didn't mean it, but there's a certain talent gap between Denzel Boston and Odunze, but they're the same makeup of receiver, right? Because Giles is 5'9", 5'9", $180, $190, somewhere in that range. Yeah. But the thing is that's kind of that's he's perfectly suited for that quick get up the field and go role. And that's exactly what he did and excelled at Saturday. And that's really all, especially when you have Rome and Jalen, who can go deep and do all those things and be those kind of big body possession receivers. Giles is the guy where it's like, hey, if I need to turn 5 yards into 25, that's the guy to do it. Not that the other two can't, but that's kind of where he comes in, similar to McMillan, where McMillan's that perfect, and I know I'm repeating myself here, but just that middle of the field security blanket, to where somebody's going to be open in this offense when you have those three on the field, right? Same thing with McMillan. Someone's going to somehow get open, and that's the key for Washington, because if you don't have either of those, they're obviously the guys still have success and get open, but that's where the offense kind of takes a little bit more to get into that third and fourth and fifth gear.
Right. And it's just having that security blanket just does so much to open up the offense, where you can kind of see Oregon's defense adjust accordingly, especially after the half. Like the play that I noticed it the most is on the second series of 3 and outs at the very end, where Michael Penix threw an incomplete drag route to Rome Odunze on 3rd and 5, where you could just kind of see that they weren't super worried about just somebody coming over the middle and just kind of sitting down right past the sticks and just falling down and moving the chains. They were way more concerned with just a whole ton of other things that were going on. They defended it really well. So that's just something it's an extra thing that just kind of, just that defensive coordinators have to worry about. And before we move on here, because next on Locked On Huskies, we are going to be giving some recruiting updates. I know Lars and I have talked to some prospects. We're going to be talking to some more over the course of the week. We've got to take a moment here and talk about our good friends over at LinkedIn, because these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's a great place. Just, do any kind of hiring. I mean, I was tempted to apply for the Washington athletic director job, which, it's state mandate has to be posted on LinkedIn just to see what kind of reaction I can get out of Lars when I say that. It's super easy. All you have to do is add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. And that's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number one, delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. Post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. I for all our YouTube viewers, I really did enjoy getting that reaction from Lars, and it's always fun to just kind of see what we can do here with some of the ad reads. But as we move on, of course, into the recruiting updates, Lars, why don't you kick us off with some of the things that we were discussing right before we got on the show that are just very interesting to hear?
Yeah, so there's a lot of there's kind of when I dug into some of the recruits that came up, both the 24 and 25. I haven't talked to some of the 26 and 27 guys yet. Just no offense to those guys who are a little farther down the road, but also more importantly because some of these guys, and so a couple of intriguing recruiting notes in particular. Demarcus Davis. The coaches call him Marmar. For all UW fans, just call him Marmar. It's going to be a lot easier for you.
It's easier.
With that being said, he's the 2024 commit from Etiwanda High School. He came up this weekend for his first quarterback commit for his first game ever. Think about that. That was his first game ever at Husky Stadium. That's awesome. So that's a cool thing for him in the future. And speaking of him in the future, one of the 2025 commits that Washington's really high on that also visited was Hassan Longstreet.
Yes.
For four-star quarterback. And one thing that Marmar told me was that he is trained consistently with Longstreet. So those two guys are very much in lockstep. So I think that helps getting both of them on campus. I mean, Washington had a number of quarterbacks on campus, but Longstreet is kind of I would probably put him at the top of the list for where they want in terms of targets in the 2025 class. Sorry. And having that relationship built in, sounds like Longstreet, certainly the game made a big impression on him. He's going to go through the process a little bit more, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Washington
push really hard there.
Right. I would not be surprised if inevitably he ends up at Washington, but I think that relationship will be very key. And similarly, another 2024 commit, Jason Robinson from Long Beach Poly, has been talking to Philip Bell and Dijon Lee, a cornerback, and I believe Dijon is a quarterback, and
Dijon's the corner, and then Philip Bell's a wide receiver.
Exactly, but two very important 4-star, arguably 5-star talents in the state of California in the 2025 class. I asked him, do you think that this game moved the needle significantly any way, shape, or form? His response was 1,000%. That story will be on Inside the Huskies, so we can check out more of that from my conversation with both of those guys. But that's something that really I didn't get a chance to ask Kaylin because Softy touched on it a little bit. This game, there's not a ton of times where you can point to one singular game and say, hey, that was the game where Washington turned around. That's the game where I truly bought into Washington. Jericho Johnson's another guy who probably could say that, right? Where he's looking at USC, Oregon, and Washington. Washington beats Oregon for a second consecutive year at Autzen and then at Husky Stadium. These are kind of the moments where, hey, this is a flag planting game. This is a significant kind of crescendoing point to where, hey, this is a turning point to where you're not just in the conversation for 4 stars, you're getting them. And then when you increase the level of talent, especially on defense, and that's the key with Dijon Lee, if you can get a 4-star marquee cornerback, bring him in every single year, that's the returning defense that you want to get that Washington used to have under Chris Peterson.
So that's one thing I wanted to touch on very briefly is just talking about just defensive backs with this class, where I have a feeling, and I've heard from some sources that that's one position to expect, like, because their names weren't really given, but that's one position where I've been told that you might want to just look for a flip, where it's just this is the position where, oh yeah, you never know what might happen down the road. And just kind of, see how things play out with certain recruits that at other schools where maybe, oh, Washington's doing really well. Yeah, maybe I'll take a December official and just kind of see what happens there. So that's a position I would want to watch out for there. And then Jericho Johnson was another, just one of the biggest names that you got to make sure you touch on at this point, right? Where he's the biggest name out there for the Huskies outside of arguably Elijah Rushing, who did not come up and visit from our understanding this weekend. But Jericho Johnson is still just having that big quality defensive tackle in there is just one of the most important pieces for any defense. And he seemed to really just enjoy his visit. We haven't gotten a chance to talk to him just yet, but he really just seemed to have a great time. And who knows how that one's going to play out, but it does seem like the Huskies have put themselves in a really good position, despite the fact that he'll probably take an unofficial to and then an official to take an official to Oregon at some point. Might do both with USC. So let's see what happens with that.
Yeah, and so I think having Jericho on campus in any way, shape, or form is good. I think, and that's the thing that kind of you have to remember with his visit to USC. It could be also against Washington. So if Washington's able to beat USC, that's a situation where, okay, yeah, he's visiting USC, but it's like, ooh, it's like Dominic Kirk's visiting Michigan State against Washington, where it's like, oh wow, he's actually considering Michigan State. It's like, well, no, I think he's more or less just it's closer in proximity to his home in Ohio, and it's a boat race, so it's not necessarily something you're concerned with, something to consider, but not necessarily something, especially if you're the Washington staff. It's like, oh no, don't visit us for the Michigan State game. We don't want you going to an opposing campus. We don't trust you or anybody else. It's like, no, let him do it.
We know why you're there.
Exactly. Yeah, we understand the assignment.
And then last guy I want to make sure we touched on was somebody who, in the most recent 247 Sports rankings update, got a massive boost, and that's edge rusher Noah Carter, who I spoke to an opposing coach who plays down there, and they said that he might have he's just talented enough to play wide receiver if he really wanted to at the college level, but he really does look like an edge rusher. And he's up to 94. So he moved from like the mid 300s, I think, somewhere right there, all the way up to 94 overall. And man, his film looks the part.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is basically his first season primarily playing defense, right? He's not known for playing defense, right? If you watch his film, right, he had more highlights on offense than he did on defense. So he's coming into this season. So it's a good sign if you're Washington, where it's like, hey, recruiting services are viewing you as an edge rusher. We're recruiting you as an edge rusher, not as an athlete. I mean, you are an athlete, right? But we want you to play edge at Washington. And then to see that development in high school is only going to help him when he gets to Washington, because then you get college coaching, a college strength program, things like that. It's going to make it even better. So it's a very promising sign, because we've talked about it before, where the narrative is, hey, we got a 4-star commitment from Washington, and then a week later the recruiting services downgrade him to a 3-star. So they've had that a couple
far too often. And
so it's nice, right? When we have to be fair, we have to point out when they go the opposite way. And so I think that's a good sign for Washington, especially with the recruiting class that they have coming in and the guys that you're likely going to lose. Not saying that Noah Carter will play a ton as a freshman, but I think if he continues along that track of development, I would not be surprised if he's like a Landon Hatchett, where he gets 4 or 5 games as a freshman.
Right. Like and that's something I know I've talked about with multiple defensive line recruits. One of them, namely being Deshaun Warner, before he committed to Kansas, and he's picked up some big time offers recently. So that's going to be a fun recruitment to watch as this plays out, because I have a feeling that there's a chance he might end up flipping to Michigan, Ohio State, some of the offers that he's picked up recently. But it's one of the things that he said that Washington was selling him on was early playing time. And that's a huge thing for any recruit, right? And I think that the most likely recruit to play early is Dominic Kirk's, because I don't know necessarily how high his ceiling might be, especially if you look at the defensive line, where he might not have the highest ceiling of the group, especially with what Noah Carter can do, but he has the highest floor, in my opinion, where, especially with all the guys that they're going to be losing along the defensive line, that he's that kind of guy where we can throw him in as a freshman, and with his size, he's not going to get overwhelmed really quickly. And we think that he can just play, not necessarily impact snaps, but he can help us out from day one kind of thing.
I agree with that. And also, if you think about the optics of that, a 4-star recruit, defensive end recruit in the Big Ten country, when your first season is now in the Big Ten, it's a good sign for recruits to say, hey, this team is now recruiting nationally and playing those guys, not just taking them to take a body and say, hey, we got a guy from Ohio, we beat Ohio State out for him, or we beat so-and-so out for him. It's like, no, there actually is substance in what they're saying, just to carry on the tradition from this past weekend.
And now it's time we're going to take a second here and switch over to the defensive side after we talk about our good friends over at Prize Picks, because I love talking about just anything related to fantasy sports. I know Lars has to listen to me talk about just fantasy just all day long whenever it's just, and especially when it comes to like the NFL. So Prize Picks is just one of the best ways to play fantasy sports, and it's really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. And just some of the things that make Prize Picks so great are quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types. And that's what makes Prize Picks the number one daily fantasy sports app. Prize Picks offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday, where each Tuesday Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide even more value. And one of the best things with the Prize Picks reboot policy, your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For NFL games and college football top 25 matchups, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with injury assurance. And you can get into the action by going to prizepicks.com/lockdowncollege and use code lockdowncollege for first deposit match up to $100. That's at prizepicks.com/lockdowncollege and use code lockdowncollege for first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. So Lars, it's just a simple question here as we start to wrap up. Can this defense win the Pac-12?
That question to me is, can Washington's defense beat Oregon a second time? And I'm inclined to say yes. I'm inclined to say because the thing is, because it's not, there's a problem. There's not a problem with the question, but the problem is the defense won't win you the game, but they won't lose you the game, right? The question is, will the offense stall a couple of times and let a team back in the game? And that's really more how I would say you would lose a game, because that's basically what happened against Oregon up until that final drive, right? Where Penix finally comes back. Because, I mean, ask Ryan Grubb, it's like, hey, back-to-back 3 and outs, basically let him back in the game. So I think the defense, we saw enough, right? And one would hope that tackling that was good at times. I will give William Inchco defensive credit, who said it was good but not great. It's like, okay, well, Mish Powell was good. There's a couple of guys that were good.
Eddie Ulafosio was great.
But here's the problem. The rest was pretty bad. And it's like that Jordan James touchdown was pretty criminal. Like, now, the only way that's not criminal is if it's, let's say you got a minute left in the game and you're going to let him score so you can get the ball back with more time on the clock, right? Because let's say if you stall him, and then they finally punch it in on 4th down with maybe 20 seconds left, you're like, wow, did we really benefit from those 3 stops just to let them in on 4th down, right? So, and again, that's the one thing that the reason for optimism is when it mattered on 4th down, they got the stops. Yeah, they were terrible on 3rd down for the most part, but when it mattered in the crucial moments, you can say the questionable play calls, but you still have to execute on defense, right? And if you look at 2 out of 3 of those, especially the final one near midfield, Mish Powell took away the outside comeback route, which is why Bo had to throw so wide, because here's the thing. If he throws that anywhere further to the right, that's a pick because there's 2 defenders there. And also, when you go back and watch the copy of the game, Eddie, I believe it was Eddie, was behind a defensive lineman when people were saying that Troy Franklin was wide open. Here's the problem. If you throw that ball back across your shoulders, Eddie's right there to pick that off.
Right. And go ahead.
So I think that's why you don't make that throw, and that's why Bo was UW's defense forced him into that situation. It wasn't just because he rolled in, because as he was rolling, yes, theoretically Bo's probably athletic enough to where he could try and go back across the grain through the middle of the field. But I don't think, especially with, I think Camp Ab was in coverage. There was somebody else where it's like you're almost talking about 2 or 3 defenders. I'm not sure that's the route you want to go.
You're right, but it's not even just that, because I wanted to take that kind of a step further and just say, yeah, Bo's athletic enough to kind of find a way to make that throw, but it takes a lot of time, right? Where he would have to stop, set his feet, turn his whole body to make that throw. And that's a lot of time because there was somebody who was starting to bear down on him on that play too. I can't remember exactly who it was from watching the film, but he wasn't, and there was a free runner who was coming like in his direction. I think it was somebody coming off the edge, but that's not going to be an easy throw to make either way. And yes, you're right. And I was looking at an EPA per play metric, and the defense is still in the positive, which is a good sign. And are they like way in the positive? No, not really. It's 0.1 or something like that, where it's good. It's the theme that we've had all year long, right? It's good enough. It's been good enough to get by. And that was kind of what William Inge said in his press conference today, was he kept just not using those words directly, but he said, when we needed to make a play, we made a play. And that's exactly what we were talking about. I remember you asked me before the second half started, are the Huskies going to get a turnover in this half? And I was like, I can see it. And you're like, yeah, no. But what did they do? They made a play when they needed to. They got the 4th down stop, and they did just enough to make it happen.
Right. And as we said, turnover on downs don't count as true turnovers, because when you look at the end of the game, the turnover margin was -1 because of Penix's interception, and Bo didn't turn the ball over. But they are just as important, right? It's the cliche of like, well, we got pressure and we forced a bad throw, but we didn't get a sack. We didn't get a quarterback hit. It's like, okay, still didn't get a sack, but at least you get an incompletion, right? The difference is when you get the pressure, it's not picked up, but they still find an open receiver and they get a first down, right? That's where it becomes a true negative. So I think you kind of split the difference, you break even, and you have to hope that maybe against Arizona State, they get some turnovers and kind of get that momentum back in the swing of things heading into the Stanford game. And then I believe USC is after that, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Right, because then it's got Oregon State, Utah, Wazoo. I don't know if that order is correct, but in those 3 teams after that. And so it's like you have to view that schedule and think, okay, I mean, Caleb Williams threw 3 interceptions against Notre Dame. I'm not saying UW's defense is as good as Notre Dame's, but there's an opening there to where, hey, if you have the good enough talent, you scheme it correctly, there's turnovers to be had. And arguably Elijah Jackson could have had an interception on some of his pass breakups. Jabbar Muhammad was fair to good for the most part. I mean, it was Jabbar's, it was much like Michael Penix. It was his worst game of the season, and Michael Penix still threw for 300. Jabbar still was under 80 yards, I believe I want to say. But that's also because he was the most targeted cornerback, bar none, on the Husky roster yesterday. It wasn't even close. I mean, Thaddeus Dixon had 3. Elijah Jackson had 4 or 5. I believe Muhammad had 9.
Wow,
8 or 9.
really 9.
So that's why when I look at those kind of levels and how it was, Mish Powell had the best yards per catch. He's the only one under 10. Everybody else was in that 12 to 15 range, which isn't great. But again, it's kind of, we said it going into the game. Oregon's going to get your yards. I mean, it's the same thing with Washington and Oregon's defense. You might get a couple of stops, but you also know they're going to score too. This isn't going to be a 45-10, 45-17 game in any way, shape, or form. So I think you kind of have to live with that and just accept that. And I mean, here's the thing. When Jabbar gave up the first one to Troy Franklin, but still came back and played pretty well on that final 4th down play as well. He wasn't the main one, but he was the one actually. I think you pointed out, wasn't he at safety?
That was a different point in the game, but yeah, where he kind of dropped back and was like playing free safety basically.
Right, and I think the reason why they're doing that is because they know Jabbar is the best defender in the secondary, bar none. But how you use him, where you can position him, because here's the thing: if he's just covering a guy, maybe taking up area, and just say Mish Powell is forcing something, that overthrow, Jabbar is right there to pick it off. So I think that's why you're having the guys in position to make the plays. Not that they're not making them; they're just sometimes the other offense executes better. It's not necessarily a true knock. It's not like there was only maybe one bad play, and it was the one against Elijah Jackson, I believe, to Troy Franklin. That was the deep shot. That was really the only one that and the other touchdown to Troy Franklin that Thaddeus Dixon got absolutely no push on Troy Franklin. And Kirk Herbstreit, as you mentioned earlier, pointed out, if Thaddeus even just bumps him, then Dom can get over. And Dom,
Right.
if you fans go back and watch the game copy, look at Dom Hampton's eyes to Thaddeus Dixon after that play.
Yeah, that was one I noticed. It's kind of on the rewatch where there's a lot going on there. But the one play I actually wanted to point out, so I'm glad you did that, was the 3rd and 13 scramble where Bo Nix picked up a first down, where both Elijah Jackson and Raylan Goforth waited until he was way beyond the line of scrimmage to converge on him, which is what allowed him to pick up all those extra yards and actually dive and get the first down. Where both of them just kind of froze and they waited. I remember watching this live and just saying, "What are they waiting for? He's running. He's running. He's running. He's running." And then he got 5-6 yards downfield, and then they started to collapse, and then they started to converge, and he still picked up the first down, but it was just kind of like, wait, why are you waiting so long? And those are the little things that they need to pick up on. Where I was talking to somebody else about it, and they said, well, Raylan Goforth was in coverage, like on the tight end, and he didn't want to get beat over his head. And it's like, yeah, I can see that, but at the same point, once that you can kind of see when he commits to run, and as talented as he is, he's not going to be able to stop his body, pull back, and then make that throw to the tight end who's in the middle of the field when he's on the just way beyond the far hash. He's basically on the sideline. So that's something where those are the kinds of plays that need to be worked out.
I agree with that. Although I will say I've never played down in football in my life. I tell all the preach that just because when I make a comment about something, I'm not saying I'm speaking from ignorance. But I think the point to remember is when you're on the field as a player, you don't necessarily know exactly where you are, where that first down line is. So it's better to be like, because hey, if he just kind of gets to the line and then dunks it over the top and they go for like 20 plus and make a big play, that's worse than allowing Bo to get 10, 12, whatever he ended up getting on that play to get the first down, right? So I think as I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying, I mean, they obviously maybe one of them commits and one of them doesn't. But if you have to remember, Raylan Goforth is a backup. Elijah Jackson is cornerback too, but also still competing with Thaddeus Dixon. So I think both of those guys maybe hadn't been in that position previously or whatever the case may be. It's just a communication error, but it's a safe communication error because it's like, okay, well, hey, if you both commit and then he just dunks it over you, now we got a problem. We got an even bigger problem.
Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the everydayers out there for tuning into Locked On Huskies like you do every single day. It's in the name. And if you're not an everydayer, we'd love for you to become one. A lot of easy ways to do that. And the easiest, just check this out right here. Wherever you listen to this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, we are there. We are everywhere. Leave us a 5-star review, like the show. Make sure you subscribe. And then if you got any questions for us, got any show ideas, whatever it is, leave it in the comments on YouTube, or you can tweet at us. We'll try to get back to as many as we possibly can. And until then, we will talk to you on Wednesday.